Thank you very much. Thank you for sticking around. You must share my passion for this topic of legal knowledge bases, or else you're just waiting for the bar to open later on. But either way, I'm glad you're still here. You're actually interested, okay. So my name is Mike Poulshock. I am a legal knowledge engineer, which is kind of a combination of a lawyer and a programmer. I work for a small software consulting company called the Exeter Group. It's based in Boston. We build, the main product we build at the moment are health exchanges. So you've heard of healthcare.gov. We didn't do that one, but we do some of the state-based exchanges. So essentially, what I do is I build systems that automate the law and policy. So what does that mean? It basically involves looking at legal source materials like regulations, statutes, case law, policy documents, and taking the rules that are in there and turning it into computer code of some kind. And the idea is that once you have done that, then you can apply the rules to different fact patterns, different cases. And I'll give you a lot of examples of that. The end goal is you get a determination or a conclusion, right? And then you take that little base of knowledge and you embed it in some sort of larger software system. Okay, so there's a lot of vocabulary that's kind of associated with this domain. Expert systems is what they called it in the 80s, but then after artificial intelligence kind of let people down, they renamed them business rule engines. So a knowledge base in the way that I'm using it is not necessarily a collection of text documents, but it's actually more a collection of algorithms that are being applied to a particular set of facts. And the process of creating those algorithms from the normative rules is called knowledge engineering. A lot of times it involves working with a subject matter expert to find out how they understand the domain, taking that knowledge and somehow representing it computationally. It also goes by policy automation or policy modeling, decision support systems, computational law. So all of these different kind of phrases, in my mind, point to the same essential activity, which is representing normative rules computationally so that you can apply them again and again as new data comes in. So I always like to see examples of things to make it easy. So let me give you some examples of different software products that have computational knowledge built into them to some level of complexity or another, right? When people ask me what I do, I always ask if they've heard of TurboTax because it's kind of the easiest way for people to relate to this, right? Someone had to take knowledge of the tax code and somehow bake it into TurboTax. TurboTax then generates this interactive interview. It collects information about you and what you've done over the last year, and it comes to determinations about how much you owe, and it makes other sorts of characterizations. So I don't work for this company, but that's my activity, right? I take the law and I bake it into systems like this. Taxes in general are kind of the first industry that has found its way to be computationalized in the law because it's very numeric, it's pretty deterministic, and the government needs its money. So they make the process easy. So here are some property tax calculators from the European Union. Sales tax, right? Complicated issue because you have so many jurisdictions. Then you have excise and use taxes. So for different things that you buy, different tax rates apply. None of it is really conceptually hard, but there's just a lot of data that all has to be made user-friendly. So here are some examples of software that does that. Healthcare.gov. So this is more along the lines of the kind of systems I've been working on lately. So behind healthcare.gov, I don't know exactly what technology they use to build it, but there are probably 3,000 or 5,000 rules that represent logic from regulations, statutes, and policy materials to help you figure out if you're eligible for Medicaid, if you're eligible for health insurance, tax credits, things like that. So you go through this interview, and then the system at the end gives you a determination. You can use that information to make decisions about your healthcare options. Okay, another example of a government website that has to administer this complex body of regulations, Social Security Administration. They try and collect your data online. Somewhere behind this is some sort of code that is probably applying federal regulations and making determinations about you. Here's an example from New Zealand. If you want to get a visa to New Zealand, you fill out this wizard and it will compute your eligibility. Here's an example from the IRS. I actually worked on this project. It's called the Interactive Tax Assistant. There are about 15 or 20 tax law topics that you can go to. Go through the interview, and it will tell you here. I think I was asking, do you need to file a tax return? It's kind of the starting question. You can find a number of child support calculators out there. They come in apps or on websites. Many of you have probably heard of LegalZoom. Prepares documents for you. I'm not sure how much actual computational knowledge is baked into this, but on some level, there must be some knowledge of the applicable law built in, because they needed to assemble documents for you that are later reviewed by human beings, paralegals. Divorce software called WeVorce. Again, I'm not sure how much family law is in this, but you can imagine that in the future, someday, state laws pertaining to divorces and family situations could be embedded in here. You can think of like the workflow of divorce. Here's an app I found online. Someone modeled the European Union Collateral Directive. I don't know what that is, but I'd rather use this than read the regulations to figure it out. And who would have thought that stormwater runoff regulations could in some level be automated, but someone has created an app. So if you're building a building, it helps you figure out if you're in compliance with that. So those are all modern apps, modern applications, but this whole concept goes back to the early days. So you can think about all the mainframe systems that are out there in the world that have some sort of knowledge of the law encoded in them, probably in COBOL. And Grace Hopper, who invented COBOL, one of her motivations in coming up with the language was to make the language easier for business users to use so that they could deal with compliance problems, so that when the business rules changed or the policy environment changed, they could change their code. So the idea of computational law goes back quite a while. And here are the basic benefits to it. One, you get consistent answers. I mean, we've all had the experience of calling a call center and getting different answers different times. Well, if you have a computer program making the determination, it's going to be consistent. It's going to be faster. Probably going to be cost effective, because you just need to basically build the system and maintain it. You don't need to employ so many humans to train them to make sure they know the law and to have them administer it. It's auditable. So when you use these systems, ideally they will give you a rationale for why they came to the conclusion they came to. And as a user, you can take that if you want to appeal the decision, or if you're the company or the agency administering it, you have a log of why you came to the decision that you came to. These systems can hold a lot of knowledge about a particular domain. Sometimes more than a single domain expert can remember offhand, and they can be updated as the law changes. Okay, so that's the kind of system that I'm talking about, right? That's just laying the groundwork for the main theme of this talk, which is the best practices for how you go about building these systems. And there's no school that you can go to, and really what I'm telling you here is just based on mistakes that I've made or mistakes that I've seen made, and I have made a lot, and I've seen a lot made. And I think the first mistake that I have seen made is that when people think about these systems, they want to think about them procedurally. They want to think about them in a step-by-step sort of way. And maybe it's because a lot of times you need to collect information in an interview, which is a step-by-step kind of process. So then people think, okay, how am I going to represent the law? It's kind of like in a step-by-step flowcharty sort of way in order to build this. It's much better if you can represent the law in a declarative way, where you're coming to a conclusion if certain conditions apply. Because policy rules and legal rules tend to be expressed in a declarative format. They are generally not expressed procedurally. And procedural representations such as flowcharts, they don't scale. So if you have an app that has 5 or 10 inputs, sure, you can represent it as a flowchart. That's not a problem. When you have an app that has 300 inputs, that's going to be a flowchart that you can't maintain. So just to emphasize the difference in the two approaches, on the left, laser pointer. Okay, here's a flowchart, procedural representation, and on the right, here are 2 examples of declarative representation. So here's sort of a natural language-y way of expressing it, and here's more of a codey way of expressing this idea of a rule. Okay, so these systems are just a lot of these rules all snapped together in some giant computational environment. Okay, so the first best practice is to take a declarative approach. The second one, in the academic literature, it's called isomorphism. The basic idea is that the code that you write should be structured similarly to the rules that you're representing, so that you can look at the regulation and you can look at your code, and there's a one-to-one correspondence between the two. Right? So you can look at a provision of law and say, oh, okay, in my code that maps to that. So that way, if someone wants to verify it, they can compare both side to side if they understand the syntax that you're using to represent the logic. And it's easier to maintain because the law is going to change. When it changes, you need to know where the code has to change. So the closer that you can get the two to be structured, the better off you are. So here's an example of part of the Code of Federal Regulations, and here's just a little snippet of logic that might capture part of what's in there. So the waiver of inadmissibility under this provision is valid if these conditions apply. So what you want to do is use the domain vocabulary. The words that are used in the regulation, you want to try to have your code reflect that. You want to use the same document structure. So legal rules are organized in statutes and regulations hierarchically. So to the degree that your code can reflect that structure, it's going to be easier to maintain. To the degree that you can include citations to the original source material, the better off you are. So in a lot of projects, managers will come to me and they'll say, why did you write it this way, or why did your team do it this way? What is the source of authority for this particular rule? If I can look at the code or look at the documentation and say, oh, it's from this provision, in the Vermont statutes, then, they go back and everyone's happy. Another thing is you're also making assumptions as you convert the law to code. And so you want to document what those assumptions are and other questions that you have. So that's isomorphism, right? Some sort of structural similarity between the original policy and the code. So to develop like this, you really need people with cross-trained, with skill sets that cross each other. So either you need to start with programmers, you don't have to make them lawyers, but somehow make them familiar and unafraid of legal materials, or you want to take people with legal experience and train them in programming. In my experience, the first is much easier than the second. And also in my experience, people with a mathematics background, I find, they pick it up the quickest in general. So I've seen it called the center of excellence approach, where you take people with both skill sets, you help them become sensitized to each other's, the knowledge each other brings, and then you have them work together in a team to build these kinds of systems. And a critical component of that is handling changes in the law. So you need some kind of process to monitor the law as it changes, have some kind of workflow where you interpret those changes and figure out where the code has to change, and then document that whole process for your own internal auditability purposes. But fundamentally, this is programming. It's a programming activity. Before I get to the next two, I just have to go into a little bit about the tree-like structure of legal rules. So if you look at these rules, the top, we're trying to figure out if the person's liable for the tax. That depends on their income and whether they're a dependent. And then we have other rules that prove those things, right? So you can imagine that these all connect together in a hierarchy, a tree structure. And as you dig down into how you define income and how you define dependent, the tree gets deeper and deeper, and you just keep going until you hit some sort of common sense concept that your user can use, or until whatever system you're integrating with has that piece of data. Okay, so it forms a big tree with, at the top of it is kind of the goal you want the system to answer, and at the bottom are the inputs. So what you need is a tool that can deal with that tree, because the fundamental challenge is, how does anyone know what the inputs are for a particular goal, and how do you know which of those inputs are relevant for a particular scenario? A lot of these applications are interactive interviews, because as you start going through the interview, what is relevant changes depending on your early answers. And so you need some way to dynamically collect that information. So whether it's for debugging purposes or for a user to use, you need some way to take that entire logical tree structure and collect the information in an automated way. So another part of that, like every solution creates its own problem. Well, once you have some sort of system that can make use of that tree, then you have this automatically generated interview, but it's not necessarily a humane or empathetic interview. It's what the software thinks should be collected next. So there's kind of this tension between having the interview be automatically generated and making it ask questions in a way that will make sense to a human being. And so you really need to separate your policy rules from any other rules that are controlling the interview itself or the user experience. So you have all sorts of rules about the sequence. You have messages that are appearing, data transformation logic and validation logic. So all of that should be kept separate from the policy rules. Okay, kind of one of my favorite topics on the subject. It has to do with time, right? And in a lot of the presentations that we've heard, there's this kind of underlying theme of time and the complication that time creates in information systems. So in these kinds of systems, one issue is that the laws are changing, and the system is going to have to deal with that fact. Secondly, the facts are changing. Right? Someone's age is changing over time. Their income is changing over time. Laws are often concerned with the way things change over time. So you'll see provisions like, in the last 6 months, was it ever true for 3 of those months that something was the case? Right? Or over the last 10 calendar weeks, was something true. So you need logic that can handle that sort of variability. And finally, the points of time that you care about may change. So you may want a determination today, or maybe you want a retroactive determination, what would have happened last month, or maybe you want to find out what might happen in the future. So all of these things make time very complicated to model and can result in very messy code unless you plan in advance. So you really, when you're looking at what you're going to model, you have to look at sort of the temporal dimension of things as you get started. And I find it helpful to think about a backdrop of absolute time. There's a calendar in the background. How do these policies and how do the changing facts fit onto this calendar? And you need functions in your programming environment that can deal with time and temporal relations, time series, things like that. The next best practice I would say is you really need the system to be aware of what it doesn't know. So expenses of whaling captains is a little part of the tax law, right? They get certain charitable deductions. So if you're building a system about that, are you going to ask someone if they're a whaling captain? How deep into that are you going to go? You have to make these decisions, but a lot of times it's just not worth going down into that level of detail because there are probably only 200 whaling captains, subject to U.S. tax law. So there are all these questions about granularity and the level of detail. And you really need your knowledge base to know what it doesn't know, so that if someone is a whaling captain, that person will be routed to a human for processing. Eighth, you need a sufficiently expressive language. There are a lot of business rule engines on the market that really are not very expressive. They try to get business users to write code, and so they don't have a lot of functions. They're not extendable, and they're also very expensive. And I'm not going to name names because there's a video going on here. But I prefer to use some sort of functional programming approach where you can really, you can build up a lot of sophisticated inferences based on very modular components. So, you can think of it as like the conservation of complexity, right? There is complexity in the regulations, and it is not going away. And if your language can't handle that complexity, whatever system you're integrating with will then have to deal with the part that your language couldn't handle. But either way, it has to be handled somewhere if you want to be able to make sophisticated determinations. So then just general software best practices, I won't go into them because they're not really specific to this domain, but functional programming, I've mentioned that, unit testing, and refactoring, which is kind of like constantly cleaning up your code and looking for ways to make things simpler. I'm a strong advocate of that. So closing thoughts, the law is inherently complicated. I mean, we live in a complicated society. The law is not going to become simpler. It's kind of fractal-esque in its shape. You can just keep going deeper and deeper into it, and maybe there's no way out. But it is more computational than it first appears because, underlying a lot of the vagueness and ambiguity is just sheer logic. And to the degree that you can capture that logic in some sort of computational environment, the computers can do the work of figuring things out rather than people. So it's kind of like these systems, they build a wrapper or an interface around the complexity of the law, and they hide all that complexity from the public or from the user. Healthcare.gov. I mean, one way to look at it is like a wrapper around the complexity of the Affordable Care Act, which is about 1,000 pages long. So whatever technical problems that website has had are nothing compared with the technical problems of having 300 million people each have to read a 1,000-page statute, right? So these systems just, in the end, they make law accessible to people, who otherwise may not have access to it. So, thank you for sticking around. Thank you for listening.